If you believe that your loving nature, your desire to make relationships better or make the world a better place, if you believe that's stronger than hostile forces, then you lean into that. And so again, when someone offends you, you go, oh, what's the lesson for me, as opposed to fighting back.
Welcome to Season 15 of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand that the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. Thanks so much for watching. Enjoy the show. Welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I am joined by Dr. Kathy Marshack, who is a licensed psychologist and a prolific writer on autism, Asperger syndrome, which she puts in quotes, neurodivergent relationships, empathy, and empathy dysfunction. Kathy's professional training and personal experience as the daughter, wife, and mother of neurodiverse family members adds profound highlights to all of her books. Two of them that I want to highlight right now is Empathy is More Than Words, Groundbreaking Tools for Neurodivergent Relationships. Kathy, you want to hold that up for us to see? Empathy is more than words, indeed. And then the second one is When Empathy Fails, How to Stop Those Hell-Bent on Destroying You. Right. So welcome to the show, Kathy.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I went onto your website and just looked up how the book is described, the second book, which is called When Empathy Fails. And so I'm just going to read out, the way the back of the book is described. Have you ever felt victimized, been swindled or lied to by your best friend? Have you ever loaned money to loved ones who squandered the gift and never paid you back? Have you had to fight unscrupulous prosecutors for your freedom? Have you ever been forced to defend yourself from a vengeful ex or ungrateful children? Have you ever bumped into a beguiling but shifty stranger? So when I read this, not only are you a licensed psychologist that probably have a lot to say about these interesting types, but you also have your own personal story. I want to begin at the beginning. So tell us a little bit about yourself and why you are drawn to this work in the first place. What's the backstory?
Well, kind of everything that you read is true for me. So if we're starting with that particular book, but I didn't start there. I didn't start with that book until I had had to deal with people that were getting in my way and causing me no end of trouble and heartache and lawsuits. And one of my favorite lines is that by the time that book was written, I'd already spent over $500,000 dealing with legal problems, divorce, but also being sued by neighbors and dealing with the small town of Vancouver, Washington, coming after me tooth and nail. So it was really horrible. And as a psychologist, I don't think, I mean, I'm a clinical psychologist, so it never occurred to me that I would really have to deal with that level of dysfunction. We kind of are naive and think that if you're just a good person, everything's going to work out. That isn't necessarily true. So when I wrote When Empathy Fails, I really was I was starting to understand better that not everybody has the same level of empathy or the ability to tap into it even. So it's not just narcissists or psychopaths that don't have empathy. Ordinary people can put their empathy on hold and still cause problems. And so I think you've talked about this before, that I call it radiant empathy. In order to really use your empathy, you have to be courageous and you have to step in and make a difference. So when I was doing the When Empathy Fails book, I came up with the empathy dysfunction scale, and I sort of rated the different levels of empathy. And like I think most people have the ability to be empathic fairly easily, but it also takes courage to do it.
So you've
So,
mentioned this empathy dysfunction. So what is empathy dysfunction, which you call EMD, and how
right.
does it hamper or get in the way of intimate relationships? Let's start there.
Well, I think empathy dysfunction, I think empathy consists of three parts. So it consists of what we would typically call empathy, or the ability to read what's going on with the other person as well as yourself. But the second part is context. So if there's a variety of cues that are going on in a relationship, contextual cues, tone of voice, the words people are using, where people, what their beliefs are, there's a lot of different things. Or we're looking at each other now and seeing backgrounds, light coming in a window. So as we're the glint on your glasses, right? I could be talking about the glint on your glasses, but I don't think it matters. That's a contextual cue that I would put out there and say I don't care about. So in order to be really empathic, I think you have to be able to notice what the cues are and then decide which ones are most important for the relationship. And that's where the conversation comes in. So it's empathy, context, and conversation. Then with regard to, we were talking a little bit earlier about autism. And there's another wonderful author who wrote a book called Context Blindness, Autism as Context Blindness. And what it is this, if you can't read which cues to respond to first, second, third, then it doesn't feel like an empathic conversation. It's empathy dysfunctional.
So that's interesting because I just had a conversation with Simon Baron-Cohen, who wrote, at least in North America, it's called The Science of Evil on Empathy and the Origins of Cruelty. And he describes an empathy continuum along a bell curve. So he says most of us, like the lion's share of us, are somewhere in the big middle. There are some that are extremely sensitive. I might call them the empaths or the highly sensitive people, but we actually explored quite a bit on the other side, people who are lacking empathy. And he described the difference that I know, and probably listeners of the show know that there are two forms of empathy: affective empathy and cognitive. So cognitive is having the capacity for perspective taking, putting yourself into someone else's shoes. So it's that understanding someone else's context and lived experience. And then there's affective empathy, where you really like feel the feels, right? And that has a lot to do with our mirror neurons and things like that. Now, he was saying that, and please validate or share your own experience through your own research. I know you've written about this yourself. He was saying that narcissists and especially psychopaths have a deficiency in empathy around affective empathy. So especially the psychopaths, they understand what someone else is going through, but they don't care if it's painful, which is why they are able to do some of the, terrible things that they're doing.
They don't care, or they don't even feel
They don't even feel it. They don't even feel it. Yeah, they don't even feel it. And then he said, folks that are on the spectrum who have autism might have a high level of affective empathy. So they feel what other people are feeling, but they don't have necessarily the strong sense of cognitive empathy where they can read facial expressions or context very well. So would you agree? Would you like to layer on to that?
Yeah, I agree, but I also want to expand on that, because I like to talk about it as people on the spectrum are transactional. But that's the behavior they use in order to understand what's going on, because they might have feelings. Yes, you're right, might be very sensitive and feeling what's going on in the room, but they don't know how to talk about it, or they don't know how to determine which piece that they're feeling they should start with. So instead, they opt for often just a transactional or analytical sort of way of talking about it. So let me give you an example.
Yeah. I was just going to ask.
Yeah, just this morning I was talking to one of my clients, and he's on the spectrum, very bright, capable, self-employed guy. And he was talking about how his wife was distressed this morning because the cat woke her up. The cat knocked something over or whatever. And she woke up and she said, "Oh, that darn cat, I won't be able to get back to sleep." He's on the spectrum. So his response was very typically autistic. He said, "It's just a cat." So what he wasn't doing was speaking to the fact that she's upset. And an empathic response would have been to pick out, he could have said something like, Oh, I'm sorry, you can't get back to sleep. Let me take care of the cat. But he didn't. He said it's just the cat. So he's speaking to a contextual piece of information, just not the relevant one to comfort her. So what happened as a result of that is that later on, she was unnerved. And so she was kind of picking on him. She's neurotypical or not non-spectrum anyway. She was sort of picking on him no matter what he did. He couldn't do it right because she was upset with the way he treated her. It was all unconscious. So I stopped him before he could finish the whole story. And I said, has it occurred to you that you missed comforting her? Going to that, using the fact that you have feelings, but you don't always have words for it, and you have alexithymia. So maybe you need to take a moment or go back later and say, this morning I should have said blah, 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 and then it's repaired. The relationship's repaired. I don't know if that's a good example. Does it make sense?
Excellent example.
The reason I gave that little example about the cat waking his wife up in the morning is that's the relationship problem. People are having a hard time focusing on why are we not getting along when it's so subtle. And if you can recognize that he didn't mean to hurt her and he needs to recognize it too, then we might be able to come up with a better way of, you slow down and let's deal with this differently. So it's often these little tiny things, and people they say things like, oh, well, we just grew apart. It's like, well, maybe, or maybe there was this misunderstanding. But another example is this autistic husband was helping his wife out in the yard. They were cleaning up winter debris and things like that. And she bent down under a tree that has low hanging branches. It might have been like a fir tree or something. And she was getting some stuff. And he reached over and pulled a branch up so that it would be easier for her, which was kind. And she said, oh, you don't have to do that. So he let it drop on her. And then he was laughing about this later, which seems kind of narcissistic, but he was laughing about it as both of them were telling me about this. And I said, oh, I don't think you understand. When she said, oh, you don't have to do that, that's a euphemism for thank you for doing that. He didn't know that. And he thought, well, she should say that then. Otherwise, I'll let the branch drop and hit her in the head. And he didn't really want to hit her in the head, but she said, you don't have to do that. So these are subtle misunderstandings that when somebody without empathy isn't reading, they have an empathy dysfunction. They don't read the subtle signals.
And even mismatch of a woman saying, do I look fat in these jeans is a euphemism for, tell me I look great right now.
Tell me how sexy I look. In fact, she's even asking for more.
Right.
Okay. So I really want to emphasize a lot that when you finally understand the difference that empathy makes in communicating all kinds of things, then you can probably solve these relationship problems.
Beautiful. So then what about alexithymia?
Well, that's another one that's, it's kind of a big term, right? And it's like, what on earth does that mean? So the way I define it is I explain to people, I think it makes sense in terms of empathy, because I will say that neurodiverse people are EMD 0, empathy dysfunction 0. And Dr. Baron Cohen says the same thing. They're 0. The same as, he says they're the same as 0. But it doesn't mean that they don't have cognitive empathy or even emotional empathy, but they're not working together. So alexithymia is when the person may feel something and have no words for it. We've all had these experiences, by the way, but people on the spectrum tend to be more disconnected from that. So you have a feeling, but you don't have a word for it. Or you have a thought, but you can't go into your feelings and say, maybe I should wait before I say that. Like it's only a cat or dropping the branch. This man has alexithymia, so he's not registering what's the right next move. And what I tell people is that if everybody slows down, if you make some notes or you think about it, you can go back later and say, I'm so sorry, I didn't realize you were saying this, or I shouldn't have dropped a branch on you. I was just responding to your immediate comment, and I don't do well. I'm sort of a black and white thinker. I call those workarounds.
Beautiful.
Use the workarounds. It's okay. We're all different.
I feel like the 15th anniversary edition, and maybe you'll hold it up, of Life with a Partner or Spouse with
I'm very
Asperger's
excited
syndrome,
about this.
going over the edge,
Yeah.
does a good job of describing how people can overcome some of the gaps that happen between partners. So could you tell me more about the book? Could you tell me more about what you hope people...
Yeah, and I want to point out, I don't know if anybody sees this down here, but this illustration was drawn by my daughter when she was 14. She's on the spectrum.
Oh,
And so I give her credit down here as the illustrator for the cover.
love it.
There's another picture in there that she drew that was totally stunning. But yeah, I published that book back in 2009. It was published by AAPC, which no longer is publishing. But it's been so many years that I thought, okay, I need to update this book. And oh my goodness, as I went through and was reading it and editing and, updating what I had written all those years ago, I went, yeah, that's still true. Yeah, that's still true. Yeah, that's still true. And I thought, oh my gosh, I really did know what I was talking about, but I didn't always have a language. I hadn't developed the empathy dysfunction scale yet when I wrote the first edition. I hadn't even figured out that empathy has more than one part, the way I look at it. And so I actually probably put about another 50% of the book is, more in here than I had in the first edition, because I really wanted to update and help people know more about dealing with going over the edge life with a partner or spouse with Asperger's syndrome. And the reason I chose that title, of course, is that I don't know how many people said I feel like I'm going over the edge, because it's so confusing to go back and forth between someone with empathy and somebody with empathy dysfunction 0, but who means well.
And what do you think? I mean, I know this is just a gut guess, but what do you think the percentage of people in North America on the spectrum is?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew that one, but I can answer a different one.
Okay.
It's about morality. And most people in North America, the bulk of the population is at about an 8th grade level of moral development. And what that means is that they're starting to step into functioning at a higher level, but not quite there yet. So I call that EMD 4. And that's what you talked about earlier, about the bulk of people are empathic. They're quite capable of understanding where other people are coming from. They just don't always do it. And because it takes courage to step up to radiant empathy. Now, there are a lot of people that I call EMD 5s, and they're very empathic people, but I still think it's EMD. That may surprise you, but I can explain that one too.
I do. Okay. And so that actually begs the question. Let's go through the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5s. Okay.
Right.
So can you track what it is like? I want to know where I fit. I want to hear how you define the EMD spectrum, and I'll see if I recognize myself.
Well, okay. EMD 0 would be autists, neurodiverse folks mostly. It doesn't mean that the apparatus isn't there, but with alexithymia generally or whatever, it's the same as 0. So that's why somebody would say it's just the cat. But I agree with Simon Baron-Cohen that it's probably EMD 0 or 0 positive, that their intention is not to cause harm. These are simple definitions, by the way. Okay. So EMD 1 are narcissists or sociopaths, fall into that category. They're highly tuned in to reading you and what's important to you. They just don't care if it hurts you. They're looking for, what can I get out of this? So they're actually reading things very, very well, but their agenda is, it's all about me and what I want. And the psychopath, of course, is wanting to harm you.
So what do you do if you've got somebody like that in your relationship, like a boss, a spouse, a sibling?
Oh, are we going to go on for a few hours? This is not easy to deal with because you won't be able to, and I do write about that in When Empathy Fails. You're not going to be able to appeal to those people to work something out with you. They're not into a win-win. They're into a win-lose. And if you're an empathic person who's reaching out to understand and to be understood, the narcissist or the EMD1 will say, aha, I gotcha.
Mm.
So the only way really to deal with that is if, unfortunately, if that's your boss, I mean, I would do my best to not work for that person, but you just got to get that. Stop setting yourself up to be, knocked out, knocked down over and over again. It just isn't worth it.
Got it.
Right. And we see this in very abusive relationships, in marriages and significant others. If you've got somebody who's empathic and you've got somebody who's an EMD1, the empath will keep being drawn into being abused as opposed to saying, nope, not doing this anymore.
Right, that's a codependency. And without sort of drilling hard down into politics, it would appear to me that enough people who are in the profession have identified a particular leader as a narcissist who's doing that with large swaths of society, right?
With gaslighting and do you know that term Gish Gallop?
No.
Oh my gosh. Gish, we can talk about this too. I love this term. I just learned about it.
How do you spell it?
GISH Gallop. So a Gish Gallop was defined in the 1960s, apparently, and it's a method of debating or arguments where it doesn't matter if you're saying the truth, doesn't matter if you're staying on topic, you just keep throwing stuff out there. And it's so transactional that the empathic person tries to respond to that stuff, as opposed to, no, don't respond to it at all. And so it appears as if they're in charge because they just keep throwing stuff out that makes no sense.
Hmm.
Right? So unfortunately, EMB1s have a lot of those skills and they know that the rest of us get pulled into it. We go, no, I didn't say that, or I didn't mean that, or that, gosh, that's not the truth. It doesn't do any good to take that position. It's better to just say, no, not going there. Not going to do it.
I hear you. Loud and clear. Loud and clear. All right. So, okay.
Let's jump ahead though to the EMD
Three.
5.
Oh,
Do you want me to do EMD 2, 3, 4? I can do all that.
please, 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 please.
Okay. Well, the EMD 2 can often function like an EMD 1, but that's generally an EMD 2 is probably someone that's, I hate to say this, but schizophrenic or has a severe head injury or something where they're not able to access things that they may have been able to use before. And so they may do things that are harmful to others or to themselves because they're just not processing. And, that's, I think we need to be aware that they don't necessarily mean to cause harm, but they still might.
Sure.
Right? But that's not the same as the autist. They don't have brain damage. Then the EMB3 might be the alcoholic or someone with bipolar disorder, where as long as they're taking care of themselves, have good medication, are eating well, they probably can be empathic and move up a stage. But if they're not diagnosed and not getting treatment, they can also, operate at a lower level of empathy. Then EMB4, I think, is the bulk of the population. These are people that have the ability to be empathic. And, but if they're scared, if they're anxious, if you're a little selfish, they may ignore the empathic part and, try to get their way, but they can be reasoned with. So if somebody's giving you a line of nonsense and they're an EMD4, you might say, I don't think that's true. And they might say, well, yeah, you're right. And they'll work with you, right? And then the EMD5, and this is my scale, this is nobody else's, but EMD5s are very empathic people, you just love them. They're such good kind hearts, but I still consider it dysfunctional if that empath isn't brave enough to use what they know. Because if they're empathic, they know a lot of stuff about what's going on in the world, and they need to step up and say something, do something, take charge. Too often the EMD5 will say things like, oh, I just can't watch the news. It's too upsetting to me. Oh, I can't talk about that. Or, oh, I could never say that. And I'm thinking, pardon me, but stop being such a wuss. You've got this talent. Let's use it to make the world a better place.
I hear
Right.
you. I hear
But
you.
it does take a lot of courage to stand up and speak your piece when you look around and nobody else gets what you get, because that's a rare population.
So I want to ask about, and they may not be on the EMDR scale, but I feel like there's a critical mass of people that identify as empaths, which are different than highly empathic people. And they are otherwise known as highly sensitive people, where they get flooded by emotions or they get saturated by other people's feelings. And they feel sort of heightened states of empathy fatigue or compassion fatigue. What do you have to say about that as a collective?
See, I'm kind of impatient with that stuff. Um, so I think that if people are highly sensitive, and I mean, I used to make myself sick all the time too. And that's the reason I wrote When Empathy Fails. I mean, I kept being drawn into these battles with people that had no idea what they were doing. And I thought, I've got to stop this. I've got to figure, I could just pull away and go hide in a cave somewhere, or I'm going to write about it. I'm going to step up and say, hey, let's work with this. So the range of what's normal for human beings is really broad. So it's not that somebody is more empathic than somebody else or whatever. I mean, that could be true. It's just that if you're highly sensitive, you need to work with how do I use that skill to my benefit? If all you can do is hide, pull the covers up and stay in bed, okay, I guess I could have some sympathy for that. But I'm also saying, why don't you figure out what you can do to be a radiant empathy angel? So that's what I talk about in Empathy is More Than Words. That's this book. Empathy is More Than Words. I finally define radiant empathy angels as people that are empathic, maybe highly sensitive, but they figured out how to take on who they are in the world, and go out there and say, okay, how can I make a difference knowing what I know?
So so this is new to me, this concept of radiant empathy, and it's alluring to me because I believe that empathy is our superpower that we could wield on purpose for better
Right.
relationships, better health, better world. So you're speaking to a simpatico. So Kathy, how do we become capable of radiant empathy? Because it seems something that we should all aspire to if we can.
Well, not everybody's a hero, but because in a way, this is you're asking, how do we step up and be heroes? In our own world? I don't mean like a superhero, but I like that concept of that's our superpower. So you probably know this. Here's a technique. The technique is whenever it makes you feel uncomfortable, hurt, angry, confused, you could go and pull back, or you could say, wait a minute, there's something going on here. There's something here I can learn from, I can get that I can use to make the world or my life or my relationship better. It doesn't have to be the world. But I think we make the world better by operating at a highly empathic level, radiant empathy angels. So the idea is we need to be conscious of this, that, well, there's so many beliefs underlying this. So if you believe that your loving nature, your desire to make relationships better or make the world a better place, if you believe that's stronger than hostile forces, then you lean into that. And so again, when someone offends you, you go, oh, what's the lesson for me, as opposed to fighting back. I think that's what Jesus meant by turning the other cheek. It doesn't mean you don't stand up for yourself. It doesn't mean you don't say, no, we're not doing that. It means, oh, this is an interesting bit of feedback, right? So even with this autistic client of mine who told his wife it was just a cat, he loved the idea that because he has alexithymia, he loved it that, okay, I can take my time and go back and repair this. That would be empathy, wouldn't it? Recognizing that I reacted too quickly for her and I need to show her that I care for her. It doesn't matter if I love her on the inside and never demonstrate it.
So it's actually an example of radiant empathy because the person did
Yes.
go to course correct with empathy as the driving force. So almost like an empathic action. I love that. And I remember what I was going for on that question, which is kind of, I wonder if these two merge or if there's some commonality. Maslow, I'm sure you're familiar with his work as a psychologist, right? He had his famous hierarchy of needs, and the highest level of human achievement in the early part of his career was self-actualization, becoming the highest version of yourself, reaching your full potential. And that's, an exciting thing to aspire towards. And then later in life, before he died, he was talking about how limited his own theory was, that in fact, it's not about becoming everything you can be. It's about being of service to something greater than self. And he called that self-transcendence, which is, I think, very much aligned with what all the spiritual traditions and wisdom traditions and ancestral traditions have spoken about forever, which is that our lives are made full and complete when we become who we can be and contribute as best as we can. Would you say that radiant empathy falls in that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would call it transpersonal, right? A transcendent. What it is that the little expression that comes to mind is you're a spiritual being having a human experience. So if you know that, then you're not going to get offended and you're not going to get drawn into the transactional EMD1, for example. I mean, we all can be fooled, clearly, but the idea is know who you really are. If you're a spiritual being having a human experience, then you go, okay, interesting. I'm uncomfortable here. Wonder what this is about. You can work with it. Yes. And the radiant empathy, that's why I say angels, radiant empathy angels are people that are pretty brave. They're not perfect. They get snagged on life too.
I love it. Keep her there. Keep him there. That was perfect timing.
She loves to participate in my calls from time to time. Anyway, so I hope I answered it. I got distracted there for a minute.
No, that there is alignment, because I see alignment. I think that's the call for purposeful empathy. And in your words, radiant empathy is very much about being of service to something greater than self. And I think
It is. And it's rewarding. I was listening to one of your podcasts where for those of us who keep practicing purposeful empathy, there it's fun. It feels good to reach out to another person. It also feels good when people get you.
Yeah,
But it feels good to get them too.
beautiful.
Right.
I have one last question, and this has been a delightful conversation, Kathy. Thank you so much for your time and all the work that you have done, sharing with through your multiple books. The question I ask of my guests is if you can think of a time in your own personal life when you were on the receiving end of empathy and what that meant for you.
So I haven't had a chance to talk about being arrested and thrown in the county jail, but I have had that happen 3 times. This is the reason that I wrote the book When Empathy Fails, because I kept being attacked. I'm not convicted of anything, but it doesn't matter. When they're out to get you, they're out to get you. So that's why the subtitle is, how to stop those hell bent on destroying you. But one, and I've got lots of examples of when I was on the receiving end, but here I am going through a divorce, got arrested. Like I said, false charges, doesn't matter. You still have to answer to the world. This is Earth. And so I'm standing there and finally being whatever they call it in jail, logged in or whatever it is before they threw me in the jail. I'm standing there in the, it's not the reception room. I can't even know what it's called in jail anymore. But anyway, I'm standing there and the sergeant's checking me in and he says, well, what are you here for? Because I look like this. What are you doing in the county jail? And I said, oh, I'm divorcing a divorce attorney. It was the first thing that came out of my mouth. I just went, I'm divorcing a local divorce attorney. And he goes, oh, I understand. I felt seen.
Mm.
He could have just said, checking me in and been businesslike, but he genuinely was connecting.
Mm.
Does that make sense? It doesn't matter where you are.
Mm.
But I also think that because I went through all of these really difficult things that I had to learn that this is Earth and that I'm a spiritual being having an earthly experience.
Mm.
Because if I just keep saying, I'm a nice person, it's all going to work out, it doesn't. You got to pay attention.
And yet you're not pessimistic, or you don't sound terribly like an axe to grind. You sound like you've come out the other side having practiced maybe some radiant empathy.
Yeah, I think that's what saves people is if you can find meaning in the human experience that you're having and that you might be being guided. I think I was guided to write these books, to talk about empathy, to learn more about it. From my perspective, that would be different than Dr. Baron Kahn or different than yourself. I mean, we all have our own little way that we're stepping into this topic, but it's a huge topic, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
It's really,
Which is why one of the first agents that I pitched the book to said there are already too many books about empathy on the market. So that's why she took a pass. And I remember that did not dissuade me. If anything, I was like, how many books about finance there are? How many books there are about whatever. I said, no, we have a dearth. We need more of this. So, you're just not the right agent for me.
Right. No, they just weren't. They didn't comprehend what was going on, that this is really powerful. And I think we're seeing that in the world.
We're at an inflection point. I'm with you there. So both of us are working to catalyze more people into the radiant empathy, purposeful empathy community. Thank you, Kathy, for all of your work. Thanks for this great conversation. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be reflecting on the continuum that you've described and are going to aspire to level 5. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's been fun.
We'll see you all next week. Thank you for watching and listening to Purposeful Empathy. Thanks so much for watching another episode of Purposeful Empathy, a show that is dedicated to amplifying the voices of people from across the globe who understand the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. So now the invitation is to subscribe to the channel and consider picking up a copy of Purposeful Empathy. Thanks again for watching. Have a great day.